processional hymns that maybe was written for the entrance of the king into the court, maybe the high priest into the temple. Whatever the setting, it's just a beautiful preparation of the heart for the arrival of the Lord. Shout joyfully to the Lord, all you lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful song. Know that the Lord is God. He made us, and we belong to him. We are his people, the flock he shepherds. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, his courts with praise. Give thanks to him, bless his name. Good indeed is the Lord. His mercy endures forever. His faithfulness lasts through every generation. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Right, well, good to be with you, and as Eileen said, wonderful for us all to be here on a summer night, beautiful summer night. But this is, at least for me, a very fun chance to get together, because a lot of times in Bible studies, whatever you want to call them, you maybe work through one book of the Bible, or if you're lucky, lots of times it's just one or two nights and you're trying to blitz through something. But really, and I can see from all the faces here that are very familiar, you guys are the uber Bible veterans and took the diocese's course and all that. But the more you open the Bible, of course, the more resonations, the more things you see resonate, right? You see certain themes that just keep coming up in different contexts. It's impossible to read any page of the New Testament without recognizing all kinds of continuing themes from the Hebrew Scriptures. And it's impossible to read any page of the Hebrew Scriptures without seeing things that resonate. So this is an opportunity to take what I would argue, and please argue with me on this if you don't agree, are four of the chief themes in all of Scripture. There's obviously more you could pick, but as I've just sat with and prayed with and listened to other people talk about Scripture, it just seems to me that these four things, at least certainly, come through again and again, and you can't even separate out each from the other. But those four being, obviously, our topics for the 4 nights. Fertility for tonight, and covenant for this will be tomorrow, and then next week, sin, and then what brings us back together, namely restitution or redemption, salvation, whatever you want to call it. Again, that idea of the fertility or the fruitfulness, that being what God creates, that is, if you like, creation. Well, if it's being out there, it's being given as a gift, and it has to be received. And that's when you get covenant. When a gift is given and it's received, now obviously it can be received in lots of different ways. It can be taken and given back. It can be taken and exploited. It can be taken and misused in all sorts of ways. That, if you like, is as good a definition of sin as any. It's that rupturing of the covenant. And then, obviously, that's not a good state to leave things in. So a healing and bringing back together is what salvation is all about. But even just look at this psalm. And I promise you, I was just flipping through a few minutes before we started here to find a psalm that was short enough. And I hit Psalm 100. But look at how these themes are right here in the psalm. And I frequently deceive you, but not this time. I truly just picked it randomly. So we're on Psalm 100. Again, you see the creation thing. Know that the Lord is God. He made us. We belong to him. Now you're getting covenant right from the beginning. We are his. He is ours. We are his people, the flock he shepherds. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, his courts with praise. Give thanks to him, bless his name. His mercy endures forever. Now, well, if mercy is being extended, there's obviously a need for it. So in as basic a line as his mercy endures forever, you've got the whole concept of breaking of covenant and healing of covenant through God's mercy. Not because we're so wonderful, but because gratuitously that forgiveness is given. So there you go, all four right there in Psalm 100. We'll be romping wildly through the Bible these 4 nights, so fasten your seatbelts. We'll be flipping back and forth through Genesis a little bit, Deuteronomy, up through the prophets, in the New Testament. So make no apologies for that, and I know for this group you don't have to. But that just bears out the point that there are golden threads that are woven through all of Scripture. The biblical authors didn't know generally that they were writing, this book of the Bible or that book of the Bible. They were sharing from their experience with the Lord. And because God is consistent, then consistent themes necessarily surface. And that's beautiful for our own spirituality. I mean, you could take any four of these, regardless of where you are on life's journey, and all four of them are woven into the life story. So those are useful in that regard as well. That's all I really want to say by way of introduction. What I want to do for each night, though, is spend a little time. We have a wonderful chunk of time, so you don't have to be rushed or anything tonight. We'll stop at the stroke of 9, but we at least have until 9. So I want to begin each session by just a little bit of sharing about what each of these words mean in our contemporary culture. Because words like covenant we don't use so much. Fertility, definitely. We use it in certain ways, carries certain connotations. We're largely among friends here, so if anyone feels called to share something of their own personal story, by all means, please do. I think that always enriches conversation. But if I just throw that word out, fertility, what are some things that come to mind? How do we as a society deal with that concept? It's obviously such an important biblical word, but what does it mean for us today? How do we approach fertility? And I don't mean that as obviously an exam question. Just what are some thoughts? Legacy, okay. So do I just want to say more about that?
Fertility is the basis of how we'll continue our race with our families.
Okay, so how families continue. Well, let's just stick with that for a minute. How important or not important would you assess the idea of legacy today? For those of you who are parents or grandparents, would you say legacy is something important for your kids or the next generation? Important for you? I don't suppose anyone would say it's not important, but sure. So you mentioned children, we're not, at least the certain sectors of our population are not replacing themselves. That's well known. So I think the idea of, at least it seems to me, the idea of fertility is that it's very planned, and so consequently, if there's a problem with it, problem with conceiving a child, it's never an easy thing, but it really is devastating. Lots of times couples have waited for quite a while. It's become a kind of industry unto itself. Fertility medication and treatment, and I'm sure we have people here from the medical field, so please, jump in. But it's a huge decision, right? It's a couple going to pursue medical treatment. How far? There's lots of treatments you might try, so just imagine, again, nobody has to share anything, but I'm sure in a room this size, some of you have either dealt with it directly or your children or from close family friends. I often find it's one of the most difficult, least discussed things in the church. I'm obviously not a parish priest anymore, but every time I ever have been, we've always done something like a night to talk about infertility, and no questions asked, just show up. There'll be no assumption that that's your problem, maybe it's someone you know. And it's always at least a crowd this size, just for people to realize that somebody else is experiencing what they're experiencing is so powerful. And it's always the same thing. Oh, I didn't know you were struggling with that. Yes, Julie.
I was driving about a week ago, and I got off 94 before, and I had to go over Tui, over toward Lake Michigan East. And I was just noticing, you go stoplight after stoplight, I believe there were 5, just on either side of the road, fertility clinic, and fertility, just, and it just, unfortunately, less, I didn't really have to worry about that, and that's not something I think of, and it just made me think, wow, there must be a big need for this.
Sure.
This is one street, with a lot of medical offices, that you see these fertility clinics.
How were they advertised, if I could ask? I mean, do you remember any of the signage?
Just like you would advertise a, this sounds bad, but not like a 7-Eleven or something,
The sign just said
They're
fertility.
literally in strip malls. If you go down Tui there, and they're in strip malls along the way, and you've got their sign just like the other businesses.
But back in our day, Father, they didn't have anything like that. It was just, people, you just saw the difference in our church and the years I've been in it. You go in and a family would fill a pew up, and that was it. There was no worrying about it. It changed everything, changed the whole mores.
Certainly, I mean, just the very concept, the expression planned parenthood, the idea that you would plan a family, and that's, I think, probably fair to say for the majority of couples today, that's something to think about a great deal, and what's the timing going to be. But definitely those kinds of things, as well as the decrease in infant mortality has a huge effect. Today, if a woman, God forbid, loses a child, I just have to think that's a rather different, the same pain for the mother, but that may be a relatively rare event, whereas clearly that was not the case for most of the history of the human race. So ways of thinking about, is fertility a word that we use a lot, or that you use a lot outside of the area of talking about childbirth?
I'm a gardener. I talk about fertility in the garden.
Yeah. Okay. Someone said fertilizer?
I said fertile land.
Fertile land.
So
Okay. Sure. So there's still that kind of agricultural aspect. Think of a place like California these days where terrible drought has been there for so long, which now is finally grabbing the consciousness of just about everyone. But it's easy to ignore that sort of thing for a long time. Yeah.
I just want to speak for the lady over here said, it's kind of funny that you said family would take up a pew and all that, but the Bible has so much infertility going on.
Oh, sure does.
It's like nobody can have a baby in the Bible until,
So does our experience help us perhaps get a little bit of a window into, we'll be looking at some of those stories like crazy. So what does that perhaps add to your reading of some of these biblical stories?
I guess if a woman was infertile, it was a curse against her. She was ostracized. And women didn't have a lot of work or whatever like they do today. But it does speak of God's mercy to women also. So there would be intervention of some type, and she would be blessed with a child and no longer be ostracized by the tribe of the Israel.
How does a woman today feel who's unable to conceive a child? Is there any? If you know anyone, and just because I'm a priest, I know several, but
I think there's more sympathy rather than ostracizing. But for the woman herself,
yeah, for the woman herself.
yeah.
Is that your hand? Please, Emily.
I've shared some with someone when they have not been able to see the child, an immense sense of loss, of grief, of separation, lack of inclusion, lack of power to not being able to touch. I remember, I could share this, a child was born, and the child was severely damaged. It was alive, and the child had trisomy, which is triple of the gene in our body. And the father is very much on this too, when you're speaking of the fertility of the child. Didn't want to see it, didn't want to touch, didn't want to do anything. And in conversation, we talked about the ability to touch, the ability to feel, that this was a love gift, and that gift of life was a gift, however perfect or imperfect it might be. And he did hold this very imperfect child. He died shortly thereafter. But that gift of touch and a sense of giving life, sharing in life, and keeping that life together were very necessary.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think sometimes, we can, in modernity or whatever, we can just talk about these things in a somewhat dispassionate or clinical way. And yes, society is very different, and we don't look upon some of these circumstances in the same way. But I mean, at the end of the day, there's pain, there's grief, there's fear, there's maybe even a sense of horror or loathing that can only be broken through by the most primal, visceral, as you mentioned, to touch, to hold. That story could have come right out of the pages of Genesis. I can tell you, I mean, maybe this is a very rare experience, but it's not rare for me, of young, very accomplished women who, struggling to conceive a child, feeling horribly isolated. Not because anyone's pointing at them saying, you're a cursed woman, but just that sense of, why is this happening to me? The pain of coming to a place like St. Joe's or any of these large suburban parishes. And maybe you don't have the queue of kids anymore, but just any kids that are running around, and all the strollers, and the longing and the grief and the shame. And all of us rationally can say, well, you should feel that way. You have our prayers, our sympathy, our support. But the last thing they want is to be publicly known or acknowledged in that way. So, I just invite us, however much we do or don't sort of share publicly, but to not just let these nights be, oh, isn't that interesting, that was in the Bible, and to really internalize that things will come up. We can't talk about such core concepts as the ones we'll be talking about without having that resonate with certain areas in our hearts. And obviously the hope is that we would be able to, as a fruit from some of this, just be able to bring it into our own prayer and perhaps share it with some others. But please, as we go on through the night, if one of you has another story or experience to share, just bring it up. Otherwise, we're just reading a book like any other book. Yes, please, go ahead.
Well, there's a whole new element that we have seen develop in our lifetime. Is the fact that man and woman has some choice for fertility. I mean, many of them are fighting, as well as those that are hoping to overcome. And the mere fact that science, whatever, can interfere or can mitigate the concept of fertility may exacerbate feelings we feel when we can't conceive.
That we should be able to do anything.
Yeah, maybe in the past, 100 years ago, it was a fact of life, and you accepted it. But now, you turn to science and say, how come? You know, like,
Absolutely, why? And I often find that with people, it's like, it is such a shock, because it's inconceivable that, wow, that this would actually happen. And then, of course, there's the whole, remember, fertility has lots of meanings to it. So then the whole question of, well, if you're talking about adoption, you're thinking about adoption, what's involved with someone coming to the point where they see that as an option? And really understanding that as being, it's a different kind of fertility, obviously, but you know, how do we view life when it's quote unquote not ours, and how does a couple begin to approach that? There's lots of parents taking on children who are not their biological children in Scripture. So that's not a new question or a new issue. So thank you for those of you who shared things, and it just gives us a nice little bit of a background to this. The first thing I want to say about fertility, you know, fruitfulness, is just to look at the word itself. I always remember when I learned the word fecund, it sounded like some sort of dirty word, like just not a clean thing, you know, it sounds like rotten or something, but of course fecund means fruitful. But our word fruitful comes from the Latin word frui, which primarily means to use. It means to use or to enjoy. So fruitfulness, in a scriptural sense, it isn't simply the produce, whether it's a child or something from the land. It's something that's intended to be used in a proper way. And I just think that's an important point. You know, you don't just have the fruit of the earth for whatever it is you want to do with it. It's meant to be used in a certain way. And so consequently, fertility is not simply the producing of, you know, new life or new plants or whatever. It is, if you like, a way of serving. You know, yes, ultimately serving God, but you could use it to serve some other purpose. But that I just encouraging us to keep that in mind, that fruitfulness, even in the word itself, though we don't recognize it anymore, it has a meaning of how you use the thing that you have. So most primary in Scripture is the idea that creation itself is fertility, and it's not creation ex nihilo, right? Remember from reading Genesis, many of you, it isn't just creating out of nothing. It is, if you like, bringing something fruitful, useful out of that which is unuseful. So what is, you know, what's going on before God says, let there be this and let there be that? What do you have in that primeval beginning of Genesis? Yeah, chaos, we'd say. Does anyone know the Hebrew word? It's kind of a fun. Tohu bohu. I don't know if anyone learned that with. Who did the scripture school here? Was it? I mean, who was the presenter? There were lots of presenters. Was it? Who's the woman from Loyola, Holly Energy? Oh yeah. She certainly would have said this if she was. Did that. Tohu bohu, which is kind of a nonsense. It's like the Hebrew version of thingamajig. It's not a real word, but it's meant to show that there's chaos. But the point is that there's something, right? It isn't just nothing. It's not a vacuum. There's this glob of chaotic stuff. You know, it's like a dust bunny, you know, under your bed. It's worse than nothing. So it's all this chaotic stuff. And what God does is He brings something useful out of it. You know, He shapes it, He forms it, He brings order into chaos. Okay? But for our purposes tonight, I want us to think about that as kind of the first example of fertility. So just to see how there's actual sexual imagery used with this, let's go to Genesis now, our first text, Genesis 1. time, in Genesis 1:1. So in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was without form or shape. Notice, not a vacuum. There's something there without form or shape. There's an abyss, darkness over the abyss, a mighty wind sweeping over the waters. So, we all have different, there's probably several different translations here. So the mighty wind sweeping over the waters, does anyone have a different translation? Spirit of God was stirring the waters. What else have we got? Just shout it out.
There was a shapeless, chaotic mess of the Spirit of God brooding over the dark vapors.
Spirit of God was brooding, Spirit of God was stirring, NAB, Spirit of God was sweeping. What else have we got? Don't be shy, no wallflowers in Bible study. Any other verbs?
The raging ocean that covered everything was engulfed in total darkness, and the Spirit of God was moving over the water.
It's moving, okay. So notice the translator here is, the translators are trying to decide what to do with this verb. It's sweeping, it's stirring, it's moving, it's brooding. Who had brooding? All right, you win the prize. Because the verb there is, it's what a hen does over her eggs or over her chicks. It's what a mother bird does, broods over it. Now, again, think of the sexual imagery there. You're literally hatching an egg, okay? It's a beautiful image. And, this is a culture where people would know what birds do with eggs. Come out of egg cartons. So this idea of God literally hatching order out of chaos, okay? So creation itself is God's fertility. Projecting God as a mother hen is a common one. It turns up in the Psalms a lot. And really a very beautiful image. Let's see where else we find this. Just an example. Let's go to Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32. Incidentally, are any of you daily mass goers? I'm sure some of you are. So today was the Moses, was up at the border. So of course at the seminary, the homily was all about Father Barron and who was being Moses and who Joshua was going to be, which I thought was a bit over the top. That's how that stuff goes. Be glad you're spared seminary homilies every day. So, but this is Deuteronomy 32. Where do I want to pick it up at? Let's say pick it up with verse 7. And so this is, again, the backstory. It's the famous song of Moses. They've just come through the Red Sea. They're obviously happy when they get on the other side. As you may know, this is thought to be perhaps the oldest text in the whole Bible. It's a very old text. And so this is Moses singing with all the people, right? They're ecstatic. They've gotten through. So verse 7. Remember the days of old. Notice, this is the Red Sea, and they're already thinking back to the good old days. So it just gives you the sense of the ancient, the ancient time we're talking about here. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of generations past. Already there's fertility in that very language. Think about the generations who come before you. Ask your father, he will inform you. Your elders, they will tell you. When the Most High allotted each nation its heritage, when he separated out human beings. Now notice, a little bit of a different tradition here. If you go back to Genesis, when do we learn that human beings get separated out into their clans? What? Yeah, Tower of Babel, right? Remember that story? Everybody learns a different language. But the punchline to that is, that's how you get the different tribes. That's an accounting for where all the different peoples come from. Well, don't assume that as Moses was composing the Song of Moses, he had chapter 11 of Genesis in his hand. What we may be seeing here are lots of different ways of trying to understand and account for. And it doesn't mean this conflicts with that, it's just a different way of talking about it. allotted each nation its heritage, and separated out human beings. You know, he's saying, you get this, you get this, you get this. He set up the boundaries of the peoples after the number of the divine beings. Divine beings, what's that? I thought there's only one God. You people heretics, you Catholics. So that's another fascinating one. Again, part of the reason why people say the Song of Moses is perhaps very ancient. We do know just from archaeology that there were polytheistic minor deities in very ancient Israel. Why do we say that? Because you find these little figurines, but don't think like these were competitors with Yahweh. Think little household gods. Even in Roman times, they had what they called household gods. So kind of like burying your St. Anthony statue or whatever. It's just, so perhaps this is the best. I mean, we could be going back to even before, Yahweh and Moses and the burning bush. But to realize in the ancient Near East, there was no question in people's minds at all that there were other gods. It's just that these were all, very small potatoes compared to Yahweh. And the eventual understanding of pure monotheism, as we know it today, was something that came out later. It doesn't mean that, they had a pantheon the way that you had Greek mythology or something like that. It just means that the original way of understanding is that every nation had its own god. So, for example, the Assyrians had the god Ashur. That's where their name comes from. Babylonians had their god. And so when nations fought against each other, it wasn't really the armies that fought, it was the gods that fought. And the people were just sort of representatives. Now, that might have been easier to believe that, you weren't the one right there on the battlefield, but in any event, this understanding of the God of Israel being the greatest God, and then eventually, right, Revelation unfolds. Think back to those of you who did the Vatican II things, Dave Irwin, for example. Eventually we come to appreciate and realize that in fact there is only one God. But keep your finger here and go to Psalm 82. This is important because when we talk about fertility, we need to realize that these texts are being produced in a world where gods are every bit as fertile or infertile as people. And in some ways the stakes are higher. If Ashur is going to conceive a child, that has international implications. But just to show you this idea of many gods, of which the God of Israel is the greatest. So Psalm 82 is, it's the council of the gods sort of thing. If you think of the book of Job, if you're familiar with that, it begins with God is in his court and all the Satan and all these sort of servants are around him. Well, this is kind of that idea, which is very common in the ancient Near East. It's one of the few times you see it represented in the Bible. And again, this is perhaps a very, very old text. But God takes a stand in the divine council, gives judgment in the midst of the gods. Okay, so this almost sounds like Zeus or Thor, or think of all those. There they are, all in their council. The God of Israel is the first. And then he accuses them. He's talking to these other gods. How long will you judge unjustly and favor the cause of the wicked? Defend the lowly and fatherless, he tells them. Render justice to the afflicted and needy. Rescue the lowly and poor. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. This is God talking to the lesser gods. And these lesser gods, then in verse 5, the gods neither know nor understand, wandering about in darkness, and all the world's foundations shake. I declare, gods though you be, now this is the head God speaking, offspring of the Most High, all of you. In other words, he's saying, you are my children. Okay? Yet like any mortal you shall die, like any prince you shall fall. And then the psalmist says, arise, O God, judge the earth, for yours are all the nations. You see what's going on there? You have this primary God who's accusing all the other gods in the council of not being nice gods. And why? What's the crime of these other gods? In the text.
unjust.
Yeah, it's social injustice.
You know, this is with us from the beginning of time to the present day. It's just absolutely unbelievable.
You're absolutely right. I mean, and so this window into, we would say into the human condition, but this is their, representation of the deities themselves. But it's remarkable in that sense. It's not he's condemning them because they're stealing his gold, or he's saying you are not being just to the people. You are immortal, and you're not being just to the widow, the orphan, the needy. It's like the Beatitudes, but it's God speaking to the lesser gods. And because of those crimes against the poor, what's going to happen to these gods? They're going to die. So in this one psalm, what you basically have is the birth of monotheism. You have the condemnation of all other gods because of their injustice to the poor. I mean, it's one of the most amazing texts, I think, in the whole Bible. And, it doesn't get a lot of ink, but it's extraordinary in that sense. Both because it shows us this polytheistic, kind of vestige, but it also shows us how that moves to a monotheistic resolution. Not because, again, if you know your Greek or Norse mythology, not because this god eats the other gods or chops their heads off, or or one of them is having an affair with his wife. It's simply you are being unjust to the poor. So now we're going to go back to the Song of Moses, Deuteronomy 31 or 32:8. When the Most High allotted, notice that same title for God, the Most High. Another reason for looking at these two texts and saying these are probably very old texts. You get different titles for God throughout the Bible. When the Most High allotted each nation its heritage, separated out human beings. He set up the boundaries of the people. Notice he's being creative. He's separating the people. He's setting up boundaries after the number of divine beings. But the Lord's portion was his people. His allotted share was Jacob. Okay. Now, when you see Lord in your English Bible, what word is that translated? Yahweh, right. When you see God, it's generally translating El, which is God, just the generic name God. But this, is out of respect for our Jewish brothers and sisters. The New Jerusalem Bible will write out Yahweh. We'll just write the word out. But I think if you don't do that, then it is important for us to remember that when you see Lord, usually written in like all capitals, with the L a little bit bigger, that that's the precise name that God reveals to Moses at Sinai. So he found them, God found his people in a wilderness, a wasteland of howling desert. He shielded them, cared for them, guarded them as the apple of his eye. That's where that expression comes from. It's in the Psalms as well. As an eagle incites its nestlings, hovering over its young, so he spread his wings, took them, bore them upon his pinions. Pinion is the underside of a bird's wing, for you Scrabble players. So let's go back to the verb. He, the NAB, the New American Bible that we read in the American church for our liturgies, hovering over its young. There's some other verbs. Brood comes back. Anything else? Louder? Enticing? Protecting? Okay. Well, he entices his nest. Can you read the whole verse? Whoever said enticing.
As the eagle enticing her young to fly and hovering over them.
Okay, so it's the hovering, but the enticing, and this idea the mother wants to get the kids out of the nest to fly. But notice that tender, maybe it's not so tender if you're a baby eagle about to get kicked out, but that tender language of the mother who wants to teach the child to fly, but hovering over them, brooding over them. Again, this is the Song of Moses. What we're talking about here is this is the great God who just brought, Charlton Heston and everyone. They've gone through the sea, this amazing dominance over nature, and then the imagery that's used is this tender mother bird, hovering over the people. My point is that's the very same imagery that you saw at creation. So notice, in the biblical imagination, what's going on here. You've got this steady stream. Genesis, the creation of everything. Here we are, all the way through the Red Sea, a lot has happened. But as they're being thankful for this being rescued by their God, what they go back to is that very primal language of the mother who's hatching the young. Maybe I've shared this in hospitals, in pastoral ministry at times. It can be a very concrete kind of image. Just that, and I hope all of us at some point in our lives have had the experience of just being held in that way. It's incredibly safe. It's a safe place to be. It's nurturing. It's all of those things. But that is both God at that amazing moment of creation. I think of William Blake's famous drawing about the creation God in Genesis. And it's coming through the Red Sea. It's in several of the Psalms, but I want us to go to some place you might not expect to find it. Go to Luke. Let me apologize in advance. I almost never say please, so there's a giant please at the beginning. I get all caught up when we talk about the Bible. So go here, go there. Go Luke, young man. Let's go to Luke 13. We'll remember this passage, but we just might not remember the imagery. Luke 13, this is Jesus looking over Jerusalem. Let me do a verse here. 13, pick it up with 13:34. We can back up a little bit. We're told about Herod's desire. So, Gospel of Luke, chapter 13. Let's pick it up with verse 31. At that time, some Pharisees came to Jesus and said, "Go away, leave this area, because Herod wants to kill you." Notice, not all the Pharisees are evil. Here are some Pharisees warning Jesus, get out. Pharisee is a big word. We can't just put everyone in one box. Go away, leave this area, because Herod wants to kill you. He replied, "Go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons, I perform healings today and tomorrow. Yet I must continue on my way today, tomorrow, and the following day, for it is impossible that a prophet should die outside of Jerusalem." Notice the setup there. Where do prophets die? At the hands of their own people, right? If you've ever been the bearer of bad news, you know what this is like. And then, maybe your Bible has a nice division and bold print for the next section. Luke was just writing, and he wasn't thinking, okay, editor, put in verse 34. So right on the heels of that experience of the poignancy that the prophet, no prophet dies outside of Jerusalem, they die at home. That Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how many times I yearned to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were unwilling. See what it does there? I think more than, Matthew often, these little postage stamp categorizations are very helpful, but Matthew always gets tagged as the Jewish gospel. I think Luke, more than anyone, very beautifully handles his Old Testament themes. Because again, for Luke, they weren't Old Testament themes. He was writing out of his tradition. But notice how he picks right up on that. And this is Jesus. But isn't it a beautiful development of that idea? That creation itself is God hatching the world out of order. That God's deep care for his people is the mother hen hatching her eggs as they come through the Red Sea. This is Jesus now, literally grieving because he's tried to, bring to fruition, to hatch the people of Jerusalem, if you like. And they refuse, like a little chick that refuses to stay under its mother's wings and just wants to go up. That's usually the one that gets eaten, right? So here he is, he's saying, I just wanted to keep you, and you wouldn't. You didn't want it. You were unwilling. It's incredibly poignant. Notice what else Luke does. Just the cadence, for those maybe you who are lectors, does this sound like anything to you though? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, da-da-da-da-da. Think of a famous Old Testament repetition of the name. And this is really stretching it, but if you remember David, when David's son is killed, remember what he says? Absalom, Absalom, da-da-da-da. Absalom, Absalom, my son, my son. And also, as David was on the heights looking out over the lands. When you go to Israel, for those of you who've been here, you can go to this, or what is purported to be this spot. It's across the Kidron Valley. And, you know, Israel hasn't developed the Kidron Valley. It's still a valley. You know, there's no settlements or anything in there. And so as you look out, you really are seeing more or less the landscape that Jesus would have looked out over. I mean, then you see a 16th century Turkish city, basically, but still, that's the place, obviously, where Jerusalem was. So notice that one theme, and as I said, it's woven through the Psalms. If it's raining tomorrow and you're not tempted to go out, you can just look up, Google it or something, and see how that image comes up. So it's fertility as a hatching, you know, much as we would associate that word. It's also important, you know, we've already alluded to the fact that infertility can be thought of as a curse, if you like. But fertility is a blessing. So, and I've said this in different gatherings that we've had here at St. Joe's, but do you remember what is the very first words that God says to human beings? Right, be fruitful and multiply. It's not the first thing he says in Genesis, but the first thing he actually says where people are around to hear it is precisely that. So let's go to Genesis, back to Genesis 1:22. And the author tells us that this is a blessing. It's not just a command. So Genesis chapter 1, and obviously the very name of Genesis is evocative of fertility. Which, of course, we should remember, it's the Greeks, right? The Hebrew name of the book is just the first words of the book. The Hebrew title of this book has nothing that suggests Genesis or birth or anything. The Greeks come along, they have to translate it into Greek. It's a different way of thinking, right? It's thinking, I've got this self-contained thing that's a book, like, you know, by this point the Greeks have been writing lots of things, and I should give it a title that somehow represents what it's about. It's very different than I just have this stream of text, and if I have to identify it, well, I'll just take the first two words, that's as good as anything, because there's not some special title. It's just this, it's like stepping into a stream that's already running. So just even the way you look at a text, and we're steeped in that tradition, you know, we are Greeks when it comes down to, give me a book, what's the title, you know, what page am I on, that kind of thing. So in the Greek translation, you know, that's where you get the Genesis word. And so if you go to Genesis 1:22, obviously human beings have just been created. Is that the one I want? What do I want? 128, thank you. Well, 122 is just important. Obviously, she comes out of, it's in 2, sorry. 128, yeah, 128 is right. So God created mankind in his image, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created him. God blessed them to the point that it's a blessing. God blessed them, be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So the exhortation to be fertile is itself a blessing. And hence, the absence of that fertility is seen as a curse. You know, to not be able to be fertile is in some ways to short circuit the very first words that God ever said to humanity. And then it comes up again in 28, in chapter 128. Well, in 22, he's talking to the animals, but still, in 28, now he's talking to human beings. God blessed them and said, be fertile and multiply, fill the earth. And obviously, the people are told to subdue it, the animals are not told to subdue it. But that whole idea of sort of caregiving or stewardship, that's the word. So this sense of a blessing, Now, what's interesting, again, we talk about the thread running through. So when do you have a second creation in Genesis? So does this, if we traveled long enough, would we get back to the Garden of Eden? No. So when do we lose the Garden of Eden? I mean, yes, Adam and Eve get kicked out of it, but when does the Garden of Eden disappear? With the flood. With the flood, you have a decreation. Obviously, when the water being represented of chaos, when the waters recede, you have a recreation. Okay? And so, appropriately enough, when they all pop out of the ark, we know the basic story. Let's go up to chapter 8 of Genesis. So, there hasn't been a whole lot of fertilizing going on. The floods come, everything is wiped out, except for Noah and the ark. But now, when they come out, chapter 8, let's pick it up with verse 15. Chapter 8, 15 of Genesis. God said to Noah, "Go out of the ark together with your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you, all creatures, birds, animals, crawling things. Let them abound. Be fertile and multiply on it." What he does is he repeats the blessing that he gave to Adam and Eve. Okay? Adam and Eve had a problem, obviously, and all humanity became so wicked and evil that God regretted, literally that's what it says, he regretted what he did, so he wipes out all life. But when they come out of the ark, now God repeats what he said the very first time. Be fruitful and multiply. And then, just in case they didn't get it, chapter 9, verse 1, again, it's a blessing. God blessed Noah and his sons, said to them, "Be fertile and multiply, fill the earth." One more time, chapter 9, verse 7. "Be fertile then, and multiply, abound on the earth and subdue it." So 3 times, almost in rapid succession, he said to Noah, "Be fertile, multiply." And you might think he needed to have it repeated, because God just wiped out all life. You sure, God? Is it going to stick this time? That kind of thing. So 3 times he repeats that beautiful blessing. And so the author of the Noah account, being very evocative of the very language at creation itself. Okay. So just want to stress there then that whole idea of representing creation as a kind of fertility, as a kind of giving birth, but both as the original blessing, this is what God wants us to do more than anything else, and then that realization of the great tenderness that God. Now, sadly, we are rarely, as we go through and we're going to start looking at the human fertility cases, we're not always so tender as that image of God's creation is with the mother hen. But it is a beautiful image, it's a very powerful one. Maybe something to pray with, it's, especially for those of you who are parents, or just think about that, of bringing you life and continuing to sort of nurture that long after they left the nest, or maybe they move back in. Recreation. There you go. Okay, so realizing that fertility then is pure gift. Okay, in other words, we don't shape our identity. One of the reasons why fertility is so important as a biblical theme is that it is a gift. It is something that God has pure control over. And when we try to control it, usually bad things happen. You might think about all sorts of lessons we could draw from that. But it is purely a gift. Right from the very beginning, God says, yes, be fertile, but you can only do that because, I'm giving you that ability. And if you want to do it right, you better do it the way I did it. Again, go back to the mother hen business. So let's just now look at some of the examples. I mean, in some ways, the story of Abraham, right from the beginning, is just this ongoing fertility story. I mean, in all sorts of remarkable ways. I'd encourage you on your own, if it's been a while, just sit down and read straight through those chapters in Genesis. He pops up in Genesis 12. We don't have time to look at all these, but you know, we know the basic story. He's this nomad, right? This not a child of Israel kind of person, from far away. God says, drop everything you have, right? Talk about a threat to fertility. Take all your security, take, you know, your wealth, take everything. Normally we think of fertility coming out of, you know, a source of plenty or a source of health. You don't think of just drop everything and now you're going to go off and be very productive. And when God tells him to go to Israel, what does he promise him? You know, what's the carrot? Yeah, land, progeny, you know, it's all again, fertile type language. You leave, I know it's not easy for you, but you leave, I'm going to bless you with the bounty that, you know, I told the very first man and woman to have. But we can pick it up with, or in particular what I want to look at is the covenant language. Now notice we're already getting into covenant themes. You can't talk about fertility without starting to run into covenant. That's why tomorrow's thing is on covenant. But let's go to Genesis 15. Well, it's worth looking at it, if you don't mind. Just go back to Genesis 12, the very first appearance of Abraham, before it's Abraham. So Genesis 12. The Lord, Yahweh, said to Abram, go forth from your land, your relatives, and from your father's house. In other words, go forth from your ancestry. You know, tomorrow's generation comes from today's. So he's saying, go away from all that. He doesn't say go with your wife. He says, go. Just go by yourself. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. Okay? Now, Abraham didn't have the book of Genesis with him, but we know that if God's going to bless him, that means God is going to make him fertile. So he follows up on that. I will make of you a great nation. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Hence, you will be a source of fertility. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will find blessing in you. Okay? All that language of fertility. So God doesn't immediately make good on his promise, but he keeps reminding him that he made this offer. So now if you go up to Genesis 15. This is one of the two accounts of the covenant with Abram. So sometime afterward, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not fear, Abram. I am your shield. I will make your reward very great. Then Abram said, Lord God, so Yahweh El, what can you give me if I die childless and have only a servant of my household, Eleazar of Damascus? So notice God is saying, I will, you know, what's his offer? Don't worry, I'm your shield, I'll make your reward very great. And you're like, okay, you know, I've come a long way, and I've got this IOU. You know, what's gonna... And Abram, when Abram kind of calls God out on it and says, is this for real? He uses the language of fertility. What can you give me if I die... In other words, if I die childless, and all that I have is this servant, what could you possibly have given me that's... You know, I don't want your shield, I don't want this reward. If I die childless, all the stuff you're going to give me isn't worth anything. That's how important it is. You know, the crux of his argument that he's arguing with God about is the fact that he's going to die childless, you know, completely infertile. And so God's been promising him, oh, you're getting this great reward. Abram continued, look, you've given me no offspring, so a servant of my household will be my heir. You know, oh, the ultimate. His servant's going to get everything that he has. God, I don't care what you're promising me, you haven't given me any offspring. Then the word of the Lord came to him. No, that one will not be your heir. Your own offspring will be your heir. Think about someone facing adoption. You know, think about that whole sense of, but I want my own. You know, that's not greedy when someone's in that situation. Canaan. I want my own. I don't want. And almost every couple I've ever worked with, it beautifully comes to embrace an adopted child, but it's passing through that passage of, but I wanted my own, and this one is not my own. Well, Abram's both going to get it, not his own and his own. Then the word of the Lord came to him. No, that will not happen. He took him outside. Look up at the sky and count the stars, if you can. Just so will your descendants be. Okay, yet another promise, but Abram's saying, okay. Abram put his faith in the Lord, who attributed it to him as an act of righteousness. That's why for the Israelites to this very day, Abram is such an important figure. Every time he's highlighted, it's because of his faithfulness. Because God is making these kind of extraordinary requests of him, and he's saying, okay, not that he's a fool, not that he's naive, but it's an act of trust based on relationship. But my point is, Abram's main thing is saying, look, I don't have any offspring, so what could you possibly offer me in place of that? And God says, your offspring will be numberless. Like elsewhere he talks about the sands on the seashore. Here he talks about the stars in the sky. But again, that sense of the pain, the difficulty of not having an offspring, and then the incredible blessing that comes with the promise, presuming that it's actually fulfilled. Well, just staying with the Abraham theme, so if you remember, Abraham does have 2 children. Who's the first child that he has? Not with Sarah. Ishmael, right? Remember the mom? Hagar, right? Hagar is the servant. Ishmael famously turns up in what he did. So, isn't that fascinating, right? That, I'm sure dissertations have been written, why Ishmael is the appropriate name for Melville's hero. But the shame that's there for Sarah, okay? Sarah is his wife. She has not been able to conceive a child. This servant woman, Hagar, does conceive. Now, there's a reason why she conceives a child. It's because Abram wants to have some, offspring. And think of just how this, reverberates through all this, Henry VIII and all that. There could be dozens of other examples, as well as non-royal famous situations. But in Genesis 16, we'll just kind of go over this kind of quickly, that Abram's wife Sarai had borne him no children. Now she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. Sarah said to Abram, but notice the language. This is Sarah saying to her husband, the Lord has kept me from bearing children. Notice that. There's no question about it. God is doing this to me. Children are a blessing. God is withholding this blessing from me. Now, we may jump in and say, well, wait, what does Sarah do? But I'm just saying, let's stick with the text. This is her way of experiencing this. And the extraordinary character to say, have intercourse with my maid. Perhaps I will have sons through her. Okay? She knows what she and Abram gave up in leaving the land where they came from. They've been given this promise of all these offspring. Not much happening on that front. And so then the ability to say, this isn't even an Israelite, right? Who's Hagar? She's an Egyptian. Okay, so so imagine you're living on many centuries later in Israel. There's no good love there with the Egyptians, certainly. And here, that's who this Hagar is. Thus, after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, took her maid. Okay, they had a child. As soon as Hagar knew she was pregnant, now notice what happens. Her mistress lost stature in her eyes. Okay? So immediately that elevates her, to have, again, the power of, and I think it's important, we can certainly look at the society and say, okay, well, thank goodness we've come a long way since then, but to just also recognize that, again, obviously I've never conceived a child, I don't have a wife, I don't have any domestic stories. But from dealing with people, there is a change when you conceive a child, when you have a child. That does put you in a different status. Whether it's with your married friends or your unmarried friends, or your friends who have children, your friends who don't have children, it's just, there's a change there, and that can affect us in all different kinds of ways. But the power in this society at this time, that here's this servant, this Egyptian, she knows what the stakes are. She knows how important a child would be to Abram and Sarah. She knows that by Sarah's own request, though I'm sure it was incredibly painful to make, now Abram has conceived a child. And so once that happens, now Sarah loses stature. So Sarah said to Abram, "This outrage against me is your fault. I myself gave my maid to your embrace. But ever since she knew she was pregnant, I have lost stature in her eyes. May the Lord decide between you and me." Okay? Really powerful language. Abram said, "Your maid is in your power. Do to her what you regard as right." There's a little baby involved in all this. Sarai then mistreated her so much that Hagar ran away. Just in that one little passage, yes, it's a biblical story, but what insight into human nature. I mean, you've got everything there. You've got jealousy. You've got the desire to take the high road, the desire to be magnanimous, and yet human nature jumping in and saying, I don't know about you, but I just think there's incredible poignancy and power, and just in that whole exchange of Sarah saying, okay, conceive a child with Hagar. What must have Hagar been thinking, I don't know, but then now she has this child, and how that begins to change the whole dynamic, such that Sarah, probably deeply regrets what she did, even though she may have thought it was a good thing, and doesn't just take it out on Hagar, but takes it out on Abram, and then Hagar herself being made to flee. Any of you who are familiar with the book of Tobit, you get very much the same dynamic going on with Sarah. Tobit's a fairly late book, so almost highly likely it was written with an eye towards this story, kind of a modernization of it. So that's the power there of fertility. Hagar runs away, of course. She has the child, Ishmael. And then, of course, Abram is allowed to have a child with Sarah. And that's, of course, as we know, Isaac. Yeah?
Sarah and Abraham had not had a child with the Rebecca couple.
Fascinating question. What do you think, and why would you think there might be or not?
That wasn't a promise.
Okay.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, repeat the question, please.
Outside.
If not been a child between Abraham and Sarah, would there not have been a covenant?
Okay, so, and you said you thought no, because it wouldn't fulfill the covenant, correct? Okay, except what did God promise to Abram? That he would have descendants. So, if you wanted to be picky, you might say, well, he'd have descendants, they just weren't with Sarah. Want to have the right kind of descendants. Have those Egyptians. Yeah. No, your question is fascinating. And clearly, we would be fair to say, hey, Abraham got shafted a little bit, if that were the. So I think and the importance of Isaac is huge. And yet, you have the whole Hagar, Ishmael, it's like you could have just left that whole thing off, and eventually, they conceived Isaac, and now we're off to the races. But I think, there's an important piece there, which is just that whole idea of, well, what do we do in the absence of fertility, which is sheer gift? Is it, well, who do we have on hand? Let's try and get a child here, no matter what. Was that part of God's, initial will? I can't definitively say it was or it wasn't. But I'm just saying, again, for any couple that's struggling to conceive a child, here's an ancient couple that's wrestling with that fertility question. And they're looking at the means around them. And maybe they had one thought of how this would turn out, but lo and behold, once the wheels start turning, things, unfold very differently. Yes, Isaac then eventually comes along, and as I said, but your question is a great one. How would that affect the covenant? But there's no definitive answer, so I think you gave a really good insight into, well, what if it was only Ishmael and Hagar? Because when Isaac then is talked about, if we go back to 17, now we're up to 17. So God had told, this is the thing you get, we'll talk about this tomorrow, there are two versions of the covenant with Abram. So in 15 we saw the covenant with Abram, in 17 you get another telling of the covenant with Abram, but it's the same promise that you will be very fertile. But then when we get to Sarah and Isaac, if you go to Genesis 17, verse 15. Just before that, he's made this covenant with Abram. Now he says, verse 15, God further said to Abraham, as for Sarah, your wife, do not call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her. Okay, as soon as you see that, you know what's coming. I will bless her. I will give you a son by her. He's just repeating himself. Her also will I bless. She will give rise to nations, and rulers of peoples will issue from her. Okay. Now notice, it's not just a promise to him, it's being very specific. Sarah will be the matriarch. Sarah will be the mother of all these people. And of course, Abram's response is classic. Falls down on his face and laughs. And you may have a footnote there that tells you Yishak, which means he laughed, is Isaac. So Isaac's name basically means he laughed. Because Abram laughed when he was told that Sarah would. As he said to himself, can a child be born to a man who was 100 years old? Well, a child was born to him, not all that much earlier. Can Sarah give birth at 90? So Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael could live in your favor. Again, remember the story of Ishmael. He went off with his mother. So what Abraham is basically saying is, come on. Sarah and I clearly can't have a child. If only, you bring Ishmael back to good standing, then maybe, God, we have the child. I mean, Abraham never pulls any punches with God. And it's why he's just such a wonderful... Remember when they're arguing over Sodom and Gomorrah, whether he can spare someone? It's too much to read. But Abram's just such a wonderful character. So he basically said, look, we're not going to have a kid. God replied, even so, God is very patient. Your wife Sarah is to bear you a son, and you shall call him Isaac. It is with him that I will maintain my covenant. See, here's where you win. What's your name again? Tim, okay. So Tim knew this was coming, but he was very humble. So it is with him that I will maintain my covenant as an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. Everlasting covenant. Ever heard that one before? Who says that? Yeah, the new and everlasting covenant. Okay? As we'll see this tomorrow. That's the whole point. Jesus uses the language that he grew up with, because it's that same thread that is flowing through, salvation history, but it's really history. It's the history of the people. So, it is with him I will maintain my covenant as an everlasting covenant. With his descendants after him. Now, as for Ishmael, I will heed you. I will bless him. Okay, so he's not going to suffer. I will make him fertile and will multiply him exceedingly. He will become the father of 12 chieftains. I mean, Ishmael is a very important character in the history of Israel. So on and so forth. Let's go up a little bit. Now, if you remember the story, again, another wonderful story. Remember Sarah and Abram, three visitors come, they're presumably angels in disguise. The letter of the Hebrews will refer to these as angels in disguise. Any Icon fan, there's the famous Rublev icon of the three visitors. But they come, Abram, hot, dusty, has Sarah bring him some food. Then verse 9, so 18:9, chapter 18, verse 9. So these three strangers, they come to Sarah and Abram, out there in the desert, and they ask, "Where's your wife Sarah?" "They're in the tent," he replies. One of them said, "I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will then have a son." Sarah was listening, just behind the tent. Now they were old, advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having her menstrual period, so Sarah laughed to herself, again, just like Abram. But she's at least laughing to herself. Abram laughed in God's face. Okay? Now that I am worn out, my husband is old, and I still have sexual pleasure. And then that's exactly, I don't know what different translation, that's exactly what the Hebrew says. So there's nothing prudish. But the Lord said to Abram, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really bear a child, old as I am? Is anything too marvelous for the Lord to do?' At the appointed time, about this same time next year, I'll return, Sarah will have a son." Sarah lies, saying, "I did not laugh," because she was afraid. Classic line. He said, "Yes, you did." Remember, we read this at the Easter Vigil. Yes, you did. So it's a wonderful. And we're told she lied because she was afraid. Oftentimes fear leads to lying. But it's just that wonderful little exchange there. She's incredulous. She can't believe it. Is this really going to happen? She tried to, she was hiding behind the tent. She didn't laugh in his face. And still, she gets called out on it. As we know, they had a child, but what's significant, I want to jump up to chapter 20. This is now the scene. I mean, Abraham's cycle are like all these little stories that sort of get pasted and patched together. Which just tells you how important he was to the people. There's probably all these Abraham tales and things, accounts and remembrances and histories and whatnot. But this is the one where Abraham and Sarah do a lot of traveling, and they come to this region, and the king kind of takes a shining to Sarah, and Abram is afraid that he'll get killed so that the king can have his wife for himself. So if you remember, who does he say Sarah is? His sister, right? And now the poor king didn't know any better, right? They lied to him. Well, let's just quickly go through this because there's a part that's relevant. So chapter 20, verse 1. From there, Abram journeyed to the region of the Negev, where he settled between Kadesh and Shur. While he resided in Gerar as an alien, Abram said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. "Well, she's your sister, she's fair game." But God came to Abimelech in a dream and said, "You are about to die because of the woman you have taken, for she has a husband." Abimelech, who had not approached her, said, "O Lord, would you kill an innocent man? Was he not the one who told me she is my sister? She herself also stated, 'He is my brother.'" Okay, so they both lied about this. "I acted with pure heart and with clean hands." God answered in a dream, "Yes, I know you did it with a pure heart. In fact, it was I who kept you from sinning against me, even though I was about to kill you. That is why I did not let you touch her. So now return the man's wife so that he may intercede for you, since he is a prophet, that you may live. But if you do not return her, you can be sure that you and all who are yours will die." Okay, so that's kind of the setup. They go back, they confront Abram. He admits, yes, he was afraid. The king basically says, "Look, why did you do this?" And then he sends them away and gives them some flocks and things, basically to try and appease God. So verse 14, "Then Abimelech took flocks and herds and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him." He's giving him all this stuff just to make sure God isn't really going to kill him. So Abraham comes off really good. He lies, nothing happens to Sarah, he gets all this wealth. Then Abimelech said, "Here my land is at your disposal. Settle wherever you please." To Sarah he said, "I hereby give your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This will preserve your honor before all who are with you, and will exonerate you before everyone." Notice he's still referring to Abraham as your brother. Abraham then interceded with God, and God restored health to Abimelech, to his wife, and his maidservants, so that, this is the key, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed every womb in Abimelech's household on account of Abraham's wife Sarah. Okay, so if you anger God, even if you do it innocently, right? I mean, Abimelech could not have been considered culpable for what was going on. And how does God punish them? Closes every womb in his house. And now he's allowed to have children. So the whole Abraham cycle is just, coursed through with fertility imagery, both as blessing, as curse, as promise, as covenant. And then we're coming to the granddaddy of them all, of course, what happens with Abram and his great offspring, of course, the Abraham and Isaac story. So let's go there. But now let's read it through the lens of everything we've been saying. So Genesis 22. If you have any Jewish friends, you may hear them refer to the Akadah, the binding of Isaac. But let's think about it, though, in terms of the fertility. And we've seen how important this is. It's so easy to take this out of context, as we do, and it's just this kind of horrific thing. And of course, I mean, it's incredibly jarring. But it's kind of a shame if it's just, I came to church today, and when they talk about, God told Abraham to kill his kid. Okay. Thank goodness we have the New Testament. And it's just this bizarre story that doesn't seem to mean anything. And then we kind of trot on. And in fact, the context is incredibly rich. And I'm not going to suggest that at the end of it, it's a warm, endearing story. But let's just look at it knowing, who Abraham is, what's been promised to him, the role that Isaac plays in all of this. And we know the basic story. Let's jump up to 22:7. Isaac spoke to his father. Father, here I am, he replied. Here are the fire and the wood, but where's the sheep for the burnt offering? My son, Abraham answered, God will provide the sheep for the burnt offering. 2 walked down. They came to the place of which God told them. Okay, we know the story. The angel holds his hand. Then notice why Abraham, why God is pleased. Verse 12. Do not lay your hand on the boy. Do not do the least thing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you did not withhold from me your son, your only one. Abraham looked up, saw a single ram. Okay, Then verse 15. A second time, the angel of the Lord... Now, we stopped the reading on Sunday on verse 14. A second time, the angel of the Lord called to Abram from heaven and said, I swear by my very self. Right? If God wants to swear, he has to swear by himself. There's no one else to call him. I swear by my very self, oracle of the Lord, that because you acted as you did in not withholding from me your son, your only one, I will bless you, so we know what's coming, and make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the gates of their enemies, and in your descendants all the nations of the earth will find blessing, because you obeyed my command. Okay. Remember what we said about fruitfulness being not just the thing itself, but what you do with it. So in some sense, what Abraham is doing with Isaac, through Isaac, is he is showing, if you like, his ultimate fidelity. He's using the fruit that was given to him, in the ultimate way of showing his reverence to God. Is it horrific for us to think of sacrificing a son? Of course, and I'm sure it wasn't easy before. But it's important to see, and lest you miss the point, the immediate follow-up is this talk about what is the fruitfulness going to be from this whole story writ large? It's going to be that God is going to be true to his promise, and you're going to have all these subsequent descendants. So that it's important that we don't simply see this as, God asked Abraham to do something really, by truth or dare. He asked him to do something really terrible. Abraham was ready to do it, so that proved, how loyal he was. I mean, it matters that it was Isaac. It matters that what God was basically saying is, I gave this to you as a gift, now will you gift it to me? In other words, will you realize that this is not yours? You know, one of the most powerful experiences I ever had as a priest was with someone who had given birth to a child that very clearly was going to die within a number of hours. And to see the parents talk about that child as this gift they had been given, and that, how blessed their lives were for this number of hours that they had with this baby in their hands. And they're right. And yet, the extraordinary, to be able to say that, when almost so much of our, why are you doing this, God? How can you take this away from me? And all of that. And I'm not suggesting they weren't grieving and hurt, and all of those things. But it's one thing to say, oh, everything that we have is a gift from God. It's another thing to say, it really is a gift from God. And, I have it to be blessed with it while I have it. And if we believe what our faith says, it's not like once it passes out of our hands, it's gone forever. And whether it's a person or whether it's a thing. But I don't know if people have any thoughts or insights. How do you look at the Abraham? Within context, how do you see it, or what does it strike you? If you were just going to think of it in its fertility sort of setting, the whole idea of sacrifice, or the call to sacrifice Isaac. Yeah. And certainly the idea behind human sacrifice, they wouldn't have looked at it as blood-curdling violence. Any sacrifice, sakra means to separate out, to make sacred, that you give as a gift to God. So the idea of sacrificing, heavily prohibited if you think of reforms of Josias in Israel, that was always spoken against. But any other thoughts?
When God asks to enter into covenant with him, he provides all that is necessary to satisfy the covenant. I was thinking about how we opened up our session with couples who get married and then they can't have children. The thought crossed my mind that during their marriage, when they hear the words that God will provide for their children, they are open to children. The question was, they say yes.
Yeah.
And saying yes is the indication that they're covenant with God to provide children.
Sure, absolutely. Will you accept children lovingly from God? That's how the phrase is. Yeah, if you can, I said this for everyone. You want to just repeat what you said about covenant? Not the whole thing.
Well, just that God,
Maybe.
and it says in covenant, he provides all that is necessary to satisfy.
That if God enters in a covenant with you, he at least gives you the opportunity to fulfill it, I guess is what he's saying. That he wouldn't ask you to do something that you don't have the ability to. So, do you have a response to that? Or? Do you want to say it? Oh, you got your hand up. You got your hand up? Yeah.
Well, just what I see from this lesson about fertility, especially those where God says, you did not withhold from me your beloved son, and then later God gives his beloved son for our sacrifice.
Sure.
That's a sacrifice for us.
Absolutely. Yeah, the whole paschal mystery absolutely is all over this. Yes?
It's not my thought, but previous commentary, putting the emphasis on Isaac. Isaac has to be willing, because he's got to be old enough to carry the wood. He's not a child.
Right.
And he is also talking about that.
Sure. And when Isaac, he raises the question, right? Where's the sacrifice? And he accepts because he trusts the Father. And Abraham doesn't lie to him. He says God will provide. And so you're already seeing how Isaac is a part of that relationship. And presumably as he was getting close to the punchline, he realized what was happening.
Isaac could have said, "Here I am."
It's good. It's a famous line, here I am. It's good. But then reactions to thoughts. Yeah.
At the beginning, you had said that, fruitfulness is use of something in a productive way. God tells Abraham, you're going to be fruitful, and he gives him a son, and then he asks him to sacrifice his son. It was a huge test to Abraham, and then to see, for God to see. And he's probably, as he's going up the hill with his son, saying, what's going on? I mean, here he told me he was going to give me children, now he wants me to give them away. But there have been the times, and you pointed out, where, he laughed at God, he challenged God.
Right.
So now here's God saying, all right, before I give you everything I told you I'm going to give you, this is a big test.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. And that history is very important. It's not like Abraham has been shy about questioning God over, the whole question of his offspring, his fertility, and whatnot. This is what he wanted more than anything else, was to have his own child, his own offspring.
We hear all about this Isaac
Yep.
and Abraham. We don't hear anything about Sarah.
You're right.
How does Sarah feel about losing her only son?
So jump in. I mean, what do you think she feels?
I think she's pretty upset.
Probably put in.
Because they apparently have very good communications between them.
That's right. I mean, I would imagine that they,
I'm going to take Isaac out and sacrifice.
Sure. With all the biblical novels and movies and poetic license, I mean, that would be a great story to dramatize, or to write a book about Sarah's perspective on the binding of Isaac. We don't know. It's pure speculation.
He just didn't tell her.
Oh. So, but notice, I mean, as we think about that, we put ourselves in that. Well, did they tell it? Didn't they tell it? What do you think? Would you have withheld from, your wife if this was the beloved child? Yes?
But it would not have been unusual, because there was human sacrifice to God Moloch, for instance. So that was something that people accepted.
Yeah. I mean, we don't see it necessarily in these accounts, but in the ancient Near East, human sacrifice is something which, yeah, absolutely. And that's viewed with great abhorrence as the history of Israel unfolds, which is the very fact that it's outlawed around the time of King Josiah. You can read about that in the Book of Kings. Tells you that it was going on. In the Hinnom Valley, you can still go there today in Israel. So, yeah. So the whole question of, and that even though in this context, this isn't a simple human sacrifice story, I mean, that it carries with it all that power precisely because of the fertility backstory. But I just want to make sure that we see it in that context, and that it isn't just some isolated, Abraham was walking along one day and God said, this would be really hard for you to do, so this was the hardest thing I could think of. That it's an intimate part of the whole question of the blessing. And notice the language, it's not just the blessing of Abraham, but it's through Abraham all the nations will be blessed. So all the world, all humanity is blessed through Abraham. We are all descended from Abraham. In the interest of time, are people familiar with the story of Tamar? It's well worth looking at, and even if we don't get to some more familiar ones. Again, talk about the stress of the importance of fertility, almost seeing it as a right. When a couple gets married in the church, this isn't in their vows, but it's in what's called the prenuptial questionnaire. What they have to promise is, I will not withhold from my spouse the right to have children. Okay? Notice the language, not, I have a right to have kids, not the Catholic Church expects me to have 2.5 children. It's, I will not withhold from my spouse the right to have children. That sense of, I cannot withhold that from you. Okay. So the story of Tamar, so we don't read the whole thing, try to back it up. So Judah is the main character, and he has this is all coming from Genesis 38, Genesis chapter 38. So Judah, one of the patriarchs, he has a daughter-in-law named Tamar, and her husband dies, and it would be part of the culture that he has to see to it that his daughter-in-law gets a new husband, because that they produce children. For various reasons, the husbands aren't, up to the task, and Tamar just feels outraged by this because she's being basically cheated out of a son, out of a child. So in chapter 38, about that time Judah went down away from his brothers, pitched his tent near a certain Adullamite named Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. He married her, had intercourse with her. She conceived and bore a son, whom she named Again she conceived and bore a son, whom she named Onan. Then she bore Stonah. All this is just saying that Judah has 3 sons. Okay. Judah then got a wife named Tamar for his firstborn. Okay. I know you need a scorecard for all this, but the point is, Judah has a son named He gets him a wife named Tamar, right? So this is the second generation from Judah. But Judah's firstborn, greatly offended the Lord, so the Lord killed him. We don't know what he did. So imagine, you have Judah, he has his daughter-in-law, married his son ticked off the Lord killed him. So now his daughter-in-law has not had a child. Then Judah says to the second son, named Onan, you conceive a child with my daughter-in-law. Onan doesn't want to do this, because if they conceive a child, it won't be his. By law, it will be the first husband's child, Okay? So basically they have intercourse, but he doesn't finish the job, and so they deliberately, he deliberately contracepts and makes sure that they're not going to have a child. But what's happening here, if you're Tamar, if you're the woman, you have a right to have a husband and have a child. And these guys are, one annoys God, so he gets killed. The other one refuses to have intercourse with her because he doesn't want to be responsible for someone else's kid, basically. Okay, then what does Judah, the father, say? He says, well, I've got one more. You just have to wait. So this is in verse 11. Remain a widow in my house until my son Shelah grows up. So we're not told what the age difference is. For he feared that Shelah also might die like his brothers. Okay, so Tamar went to live in her father's house. Time passed. The daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. After Judah completed the period of mourning, he went up to Timnah. Okay, again, easy to lose the details here. The point is, Judah has asked his daughter-in-law to wait until the third son, who's just a little guy, grows up and is old enough so they can see him. Never mind how old Tamar is going to be by that point. But in the meantime, Judah's wife dies, and so he's going to go off into mourning. Okay? So he's basically leaving Tamar on her own. So verse 13, Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So what does she do? She takes off her widow's garments, right? 2 of her husbands are gone, covers herself with a shawl, disguises herself basically. Then she goes and sits down at the entrance to Engang, which is on the way to Timnah. For she was aware that although Shelah was now grown up, that's the guy she's supposed to marry, she had not been given to him in marriage. In other words, Judah had made this promise, when my third son grows up, he'll marry you, he'll have a kid. But he's dragging his feet, he's not doing it. What does Tamar do? She disguises herself and she goes off to sit by the side of the road where she knows Judah is going to be passing by, her father-in-law. Basically, she disguises herself as a prostitute. Verse 15, When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, since she had covered her face. So he went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me have intercourse with you." For he did not realize that she was his daughter-in-law. She replied, "What will you pay me for letting me have intercourse with you?" "I will send you a young goat from the flock." "Very well, provided you leave me a pledge until you send it." "What pledge shall I leave you?" "Your seal and cord, and the staff in your hand." So she's asking for things that would unmistakably identify this person as Judah. So he gives them to her, they have intercourse, she conceives a child. This is with her father-in-law. Okay? Why is she doing this? Because she's been driven to it in a sense. 3 times, well, the one guy was killed and the other 2 refused to cooperate. So she's saying, all right, I'm going to go to these extreme means. Then Judah sent the young goat. Okay, so he's going to pay. He still doesn't know who she was. He wants to recover the pledge. He asks the men, "Where is the prostitute?" There was no prostitute, they said. Long story short, it plays out. She shows him the cord and basically confronts him and says, "I was the one you were with." And it's an extraordinary story. And then verse 26. And again, you see the culture. Before he knows that it was he who impregnated her, they bring out his daughter-in-law and she's pregnant. He said, "We'll kill you," basically. How dare you go off and conceive a child? Because my son was supposed to be, ready for you. Obviously, that wasn't happening. And then they're about to kill her, and then she pulls out the sign that, it was you, by the way. And then in verse 26, Judah recognized these signs and said, "She is in the right rather than I, since I did not give her to my son, Shelah." She had no further sexual relations with her. He had none. When the time of the delivery came, there were twins in the womb. She was giving birth. Again, just these little strange stories that turn up and then never. So while the one is putting his hand out, the midwife ties a red thread on it. Noting, this is the one who came out first. I guess that's so you can tell. The one who came out first has the red string on his finger. But as he withdrew his hand, his brother came out and said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Yeah, Perez means breach. And afterward, his brother, who had the crimson thread on his hand, came out. He was called Sarah. So neat little side story there. My point is, you see the power of fertility and of having a child. That here this woman, Tamar, would go to these extraordinary lengths to conceive a child, at least within the family. And it's a horrific story for the Israelites. But she's not held in abhorrence. It's not as if she's being presented as an evil person by any means. It's Judah who comes up short, at least in that story. Okay. Last few minutes, a key piece that's really central is recognizing that fertility, and this goes back to what Tim was saying, is also a reward for covenantal faithfulness. So if you keep the covenant, and we'll obviously talk about this more tomorrow, so go to Deuteronomy 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7, I'm going to pick it up with verse 5. This is God talking to the people saying, this is how, as they come into the promised land, they should deal with the folks who are already there. This is how you must deal with them. Tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars. So these are all altars to false gods. Chop down their asherahs, destroy their idols by fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord. And then I'm going to jump up quite a bit to verse 12. As your reward for heeding these ordinances and keeping them carefully, the Lord your God will keep with you the covenant mercy he promised on oath to your ancestors. That would be Abraham. Right now we're in the time of Moses. We're much, much later. He, God, verse 13, will love and bless, so we know what's coming, will multiply you. He will bless the fruit of your womb and the produce of your soil, your grain, your wine. Why will he do all this? If you keep the commandments, if you keep the covenant. The young of your herds, the offspring of your flocks, and the land which he swore to your ancestors he would give you. That was the promise to Abraham. You will be blessed above all peoples. No man or woman among you shall be childless, nor shall your livestock be barren. Notice that extraordinary promise. You will not be barren. If you keep to the covenant, this is what I promise you. Not just you will have many offspring, but you will not be barren. And so on and so forth. There's a danger with fertility, though. And the danger is you become self-focused. The danger is that you think you're the reason you're so blessed. The danger is you think you're the one who's produced all this wealth. You're the one who's producing the children. Again, you see human nature there. Something you want so bad, you strive for so hard. Okay, finally you get it. Well, sometimes you can easily forget, or your children can forget, or the second generation can forget how difficult it was to come by. So God knows this, and he's worried. So go to Deuteronomy, just the very next chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 8. You can almost hear a parent saying to the kid, well, all right, I'm giving you this car, but don't forget. So chapter 8, verse 7. So this is, again, the author of Deuteronomy didn't think he was writing chapter 8 after chapter 7. This is all part of a continuous, God basically telling the people that he's going to bless them, but then there's a warning. So chapter 8, verse 7. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good country, a land with streams of water, with springs, fountains, welling up in the hills and valleys, a land of wheat and barley, blah, 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 blah. Chapter verse 10. But when you have eaten and are satisfied, you must bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. What does it mean to bless God? Well, basically to acknowledge what he has blessed you with. Verse 11, be careful not to forget the Lord. The worst thing you can do is forget God. Not to forget the Lord your God by failing to keep his commandments and ordinances and statutes, which I enjoin in you today. Lest, when you have eaten and are satisfied, and have built fine houses and lived in them, and your herds and flocks have increased, your silver and gold has increased, all your property is increased, you then become haughty of heart, and forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that house of slavery. He guided you through the vast and terrible wilderness with its serpents, blah, blah, blah. Verse 17. Otherwise, you might say in your heart, it is my own power and strength, of my own hand that has got me this wealth. Remember then the Lord your God, for he is the one who gives you the power to get wealth, by fulfilling, as he has now done, the covenant he swore to your ancestors. Okay, so you see there the danger of fertility? The danger of fertility is that you forget it was pure gift. And to forget the source of fertility is to forget God himself. Last little header on this one, you see this all the way back with Eve herself. Okay? Let's go back to when Adam is, or what's their first kid's name? Cain is born. My two sons. All right. Go to Genesis 4. It's a small thing, but everything in the Bible is small, right? They're very short, tight narratives. So, sometimes you're just looking at a verse or two, but the language is important. So chapter 4 of Genesis, verse 1. The man had intercourse with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, saying, I have produced a male child with the help of the Lord. So who did all the hard work? And who helped? Remember the old shake and bake commercials? And I helped. Remember that one? I can't use that with my son. And I helped. So I produced this child, and God helped me. Okay, well, we all know how things turn out with Cain and Abel. Anyone remember the name of the third son? Seth. Let's see what happens when Seth is born. So now we're going to go to Genesis 4, but all the way at the end, 25. Okay, these are bookends. Adam again had intercourse with his wife, the very same language. She gave birth to a son whom she called Seth. Okay, just change the names, that's exactly how the other verse started. Now what does she say? God has granted me another offspring in place of Abel. What's the difference? Yes, she's accepting it as a gift. Now here, I mean, you follow, but what are some things you imagine she might have learned from giving birth to Cain to giving birth to Seth? You know, probably a lot of humility, probably some insight into the human condition and what we're capable of. You know, the whole Cain and Abel story in some ways is people not being satisfied with how God responds to them. You know, how come you're not accepting my gift? Why, you know, it's, I mean, more than we have time to go into here, but it's a fascinating distinction. And why, if I had to give the Nobel Prize in Literature to any biblical author, I'd give it to the author of Genesis 1 to 11. I mean, you will never find a more packed series of texts that just give you window after window into the human heart, why we are the way we are, how we behave. But just in that little subtle thing, I have conceived a child and God helped. You know, they kill each other, you know, all sorts of horrible things. Will we ever have another child? Or will we ever be blessed again? Wow, it happens. Something that comes to mind for me is couples who've had abortions and that incredible feeling. You know, they're modern, they don't think, you know, oh, God is punishing them, they're all, you know, we're all very sophisticated, but they'll use language like, will we ever have another child? You know, I'm so afraid that somehow we're going to be punished, that we'll never have another child. Just that sense of what changes you from a sense of entitlement to a feeling of, would I ever dare be gifted? You know, whether it's children, whatever it is. But what makes you appreciative, rightly or wrongly, sometimes it's precisely, you know, either having lost or having come close, and, you know, just within arm's reach and not getting it. But as soon as you talk about fertility, you know, you're talking about all of that. You know, because it's not a given, it's not automatic. It is so precious. You can get so close and then not have it. You can have it and lose it. You know, whether it's children, whether it's fruit of the land, what have you. And you know, we didn't even go into this, but think about the role of fertility, obviously with Jesus coming. You know, with Mary and being. Now that we know how important fertility is, the idea that there's a child that you're not responsible for is a huge, huge thing. So, just to think about that's the backstory to God. I mean, we'll look at that more tomorrow. So as we move into covenant then, we've already talked about a lot of covenant. You can't have one without the other. For those who are interested, I'm going to give you a few texts that you may want to look at tomorrow before we gather. And you'll have every right to say, why didn't you give us to these in advance? And all I can say is because I had a day job. And I just didn't get to them. So this was a little bit later. For next week, I'll be able to email or if Eileen is able to find what I wanted. Okay, so some covenant things. Genesis 3, so the whole chapter is the Adam and Eve story. The classic Abraham covenants, we've looked at pieces of them, zeroing in on fertility, but Genesis 15, chapter 15, and Genesis 17. And as you read those two, just compare what's different in them. They're both accounts of the covenant with Abraham, but there are distinctions. The Noah covenant, that's Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 to 17. Genesis 9, verses 1 to 17. The granddaddy of all covenants, Moses, on the mountaintop there. You'll find that numerous places, but maybe if you would look at Exodus chapter 24, verse 1 to 7. Exodus 24, verse 1 to 7. And then Exodus 34, verses 10 to 28. Exodus 34, verses 10 to 28. If you're really ambitious, there's a covenant with David. This is in the second book of Samuel. So 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 to 17. So 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 to 17. The new covenant that turns up long before Jesus, because Jesus quotes it in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 27 to 34. It's Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 27 to 34. And then what's responsible for all of us being here tonight, of course, Christ, the new covenant. You'll find that in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verses 19 to 20. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verses 26 to 29. Matthew, chapter 26, verses 26 to 29. And then Paul gives us probably the most famous wording. Second letter to the Corinthians. Second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 3, verses 4 to 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 4 to 11. And then the letter to the Hebrews talks about the Abrahamic covenant through a Christian perspective. So the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 8, verses 6 through 13. Letter to the Hebrews, chapter 8, verses 6 through 13. If you added all those things up, you'd only get about 2 pages, so it isn't. And then the last thing, which is really, again, ties all this together. Everyone here has probably read it once, but if you get a chance, read the book of Ruth. Ruth has fertility, it has covenant, it has intrigue, it has love, it has romance, it has everything. And it wonderfully captures, it has redemption, it has sin, depending on how prudish you are, but it's kind of a Rorschach test. It's a wonderful book. And even I would say if you don't want to read all the other things, do look at Ruth. But all those verses, they're not, if everyone just reads a few, we'll be able to